And it was pretty wild to see the drop go live, and then like within hours, the funds like ended up in everybody, like all the recipients' wallets, right? And I think it costs $40 to distribute like hundreds of thousands in real time. They get paid that same day, and it costs like a tiny percent. It was one of those things where it's like crypto rails are superior for some things.
Yeah, I do not want my heart on my sleeve. I cannot let them see in too deep, cause I know they can use it against me. Only one I can trust is me. I got niggas I keep.
Episode 28 of Invest in Music with Abram Dawson of Splits. Today we're here to talk about 0xSplits' new naming system and how they're powering the on-chain music economy with their backend earnings system. As a reminder, you can collect this episode on investingmusic.xyz. It's the best way to support our guests, and I'm extremely excited about Splits. They're powering everything from chaos to sound. We've got quite a lot to cover, so without further ado, let's get into it. Episode 28 of Invest in Music with Abram Dawson from Splits. We are back. We got Abram from Splits in the house today. Abram, how we doing, man?
Great. Thanks for having me, Coop.
Of course. Really glad that you're here. We're going to be talking all about on-chain earnings today. As the co-founder of 0xSplits, you guys are basically powering the whole back end of this on-chain music ecosystem. So very excited to get into it. But before we deep dive, why don't you give a quick background on yourself and what brings you here today?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. I started building Splits about 2 years ago. My co-founder Will and I had worked together for several years on the kind of like, I guess it's like consultants. We were building software as like a small 2-person team within the context of a larger team, and started dabbling in crypto a number of years ago. Brought Splits to life at a hackathon project. Actually, it was like a ETH Global hackathon back in 2021, and thought this was something that we could ship in the order of 3 weeks. I would say we shipped most of it. It was kind of like the back end talking to the front end. That was the hardest part to get done. Because Will comes at it from like the back end perspective, me more from the front end. And so actually getting those two to talk together was a little bit more than we realized. And then before Splits, I was working in early stage startups, not at a startup, but more on like the investor side. So been building digital software for a while now.
Let's go into that a little bit more, because I want to spend the majority of our conversation talking about where Splits is at today, but I think that background is very helpful here. So you mentioned before you guys did this project at a hackathon, you had already been working in tech for a while, you've been investing and kind of around early stage software. What was your most, earliest memory with regards to kind of getting involved with the technology space as a whole?
Oh, geez. Growing up, there was this is going way back. There was this like dump in my town that, the trash wasn't like picked up. We'd actually, I grew up in the outside of Boston, kind of a small town out there. And the trash wasn't picked up, and so we go to the dump on the weekends. That was like something my siblings and I would do with my dad mostly. And at the dump, they had a section called the Give and Take. And the Give and Take was a place where you could find things that weren't quite trash, but that someone didn't want them anymore. So it's kind of like a free yard sale. And they had a shipping container that was just kind of where you put the electronics, because everything else was outside. So if you have like plastic toys or whatever, that would just go outside. But if you had electronics that didn't want to get wet, or that shouldn't get wet, that would damage them, they'd go into a shipping container. And I often found myself just naturally gravitating towards that shipping container. I didn't find, things that were super valuable, but you could still bring them home, take them apart, figure out how they worked. And so started doing that at a pretty young age. And then in college, it was always like kind of growing up, like I was always like tinkering, building small, devices, simple machines, just like, like I had like a barn, like a farm animals. We had a bunch of stuff growing up. And so my dad had a big workbench, so I'd be like on that a bunch. And then when I got to college, no more workbench, no more space. And so that's when I started really diving into the digital software side of things. And so that was actually, fun enough, I like built a bunch of music blogs for some friends.
Cool.
This is back in like 2008, 2009. Like SoundCloud, I guess, early era, or like a little bit before that. Everybody was kind of building their own blog, so I helped with that. Had a few different ideas that, I wasn't super technical at that point, but I like designing things, and I like building things. And so just kind of taught myself basic HTML, CSS, front end design work. And so eventually paired up with a bunch of different programmers over the past several years. And so yeah, I've really just gravitated towards building software. Digital products is really, I don't know, I find it very relaxing.
What does building a music blog in 2008 look like?
Oh, geez. I think a lot of them were backed by WordPress. So we use like WordPress as the back end, and I would come in and build custom themes for a bunch of my friends. So I wasn't doing the actual, storage logic. It was just like the display, the front end, and then like building little widgets that people could get music hosted somewhere else into their website as well.
It's fascinating. And then at what point in your life did you start to go more into the investing consulting side of things?
When I was told that the idea I was working on was bad, but that I was potentially a valuable employee, was like more or less the short of it. A friend and I, this person, Matt, we had built a number of projects throughout college. He studied like computer engineering in college. I studied like business and econ, but again, was kind of dabbling in the front end product design stuff, and had built this, full circle actually, had built this mobile app. It was called Token. This is like well before, even well before like the Bitcoin white paper. And the idea was, it was kind of like referral marketing, right? So it was like Groupon-esque, but the idea would be like, Cooper, you live in LA, you know my preferences, like you should be able to give me discounts at your favorite restaurants as a way to drive more traffic to them. Anyways, it didn't work for a number of reasons, but we built this prototype and had maybe like 50 to 60 of our friends in college using it. And as we were thinking about what we were going to do after school, we ended up talking to a handful of angel investors, and we like went through like plug and play and like a few of these like different incubator things. And one of the groups we ended up getting in touch with was SV Angel. And I remember Kevin Carter's a partner there. His feedback was, in not so many words, we really like you. We don't really like this idea. Do you want to come and intern for us for a few months? And I was about to graduate college, and I knew I didn't want to go like work in like some big tech job. I really enjoyed bringing things from like 0 to 1. I'd done that a few times in college and wanted to continue to do that. And so Kevin's offer, I think I made like $1,000 a month for like 3 or 4 months as I was like this intern. So it wasn't unpaid, but it was low income, not quite enough to like offset the San Francisco rent. But so I jumped at that chance. It was like a really great opportunity to like build a network, see the other side of the table. I was actually initially tasked with building a way for founders to book office hours with the partners at SV Angel. So I built that out during my internship. And in hindsight, I'm not sure that the team at SV really expected that software to be used. I think it was more a test of can he learn on his own without much direction. And so I kind of just like, there's actually one cafe in Coal Valley that I spent like 4 weeks at, just like learning at that time like PHP, and like built like a MySQL app, and like building out this tool for founders to book office hours. And then after a few months on the internship, they offered me a full-time job. So I joined SV Angel in 2012, and I was there until 2018. And so for most of that time, I was pretty much just like purely on the investing side. So SV Angel, when I joined, was 4 partners and myself. And so I was doing a lot of that initial review and meeting with founders as they were coming through, and then kind of helping to be that support system as we move from the like diligence to the investing and support process. And so I did that for I was at SV Angel for about 6 years, 4 of which I was just focused on the investing and supporting portfolio founders. And then the last 2 years, actually, you know him, Kartik, from, he's now at A Capital. But he was at SV Angel as well. He interned for us, and then he came in and joined us full time. And the two of us built a whole operating system for SV Angel. We were using like Salesforce at the time. And I mean, Salesforce is great when you're a team of, thousands of people. And there really wasn't any good software built for this like small group of people investing together, raising funds from LPs, all of that stuff. And so we built a bunch of that stuff out. let's see. Yeah, that was my first. Yeah, and then that was introduction to like a whole new code base of like React. I think we were using semantic UI at that point, but yeah.
Is that how you got to see Kartik build ETH Global from the ground up? I mean, I'm just very curious about that timeline. Like, it feels like if he was interning at SV Angel, I'm going to assume this was probably prior to the ETH Global hackathons becoming such a paramount part of the culture that they are today. What was your earliest insight into this whole like ETH Global developer community?
You know, before getting to ETH Global real quick, a funny thing, I actually met Kartik at a hackathon. Nice. It was called Angel Hack in like 2013. He had built this Gmail extension, and I was like, hey, this person seems really sharp. You know, we kind of became friends. He came and interned, and at that time, he had just started Hack the North, which is a hackathon at Waterloo. And so he had done Hack the North, and then, and I think Liam, who's another founder of ETH Global, they worked together on Hack the North, and I'm sure I'm missing some folks as well. But it wasn't that surprising to see ETH Global come about, just given like Kartik's experience, like participating as attendees at these hackathons, to then running Hack the North, which was like it's a very large hackathon. I think it's still ongoing at Waterloo. And so to then see it kind of come again full circle with ETH Global, you know, Kartik's been involved in the Ethereum ecosystem for a very long time now. And so, yeah, I mean, we're huge supporters of ETH Global. At some point, we want to be able to support it as more than just attendees, but, you know, maybe sponsored or something one of these days. You know, we have a lot to be very appreciative for ETH Global, of ETH Global, not just as a team split. I mean, that is where we got our start, but as the ecosystem in general. I mean, what they're doing over there is incredible, bringing everybody and teaching everybody about this new technology.
100%. I mean, that's definitely where I found my footing within the Ethereum community. Was you would go to these very extravagant crypto conferences, like, you know, Consensus in Singapore, and all these like just like booth heavy events where it was just like a million projects just shilling whatever they were building. And then you would go to like one of these ETH Global hackathons, and you would see the difference between a booth that was based off of an ICO that raised funds to build something in the future versus like the ground floor of developers building things in real time. And I think when I started to gravitate more towards the crowd of people who were being actively involved with the ETH Global events, that's when I started to really see, here are the people that are like getting their hands dirty and building things versus here are the people that are using the hype of the space to be able to raise capital. And I think it was just a really healthy way to just focus and center yourself around like what's actually being developed versus the pie in the sky ideology of like ICOs and raising a bunch of funds to build something that most times never ended up coming to fruition.
Right. I mean, building anything from the ground up is really hard and takes a lot of effort. And so I have a lot of respect for the people who are participating, even if it's just a weekend hackathon or a month long or, you know, a few weeks. I think that getting together, having the motivation and ability to actually like bring something from 0 to 1 and ship it in that period of time, I think is hugely valuable. And I agree, that's definitely more the audience or the community that I relate to versus the, I don't know, maybe speculative or however you want to call it. Yeah.
Right. So let's transition into the Splits origin story. So you mentioned that you guys built Splits as the result of one of these ETH Global hackathons. How did you and your co-founder first meet initially, and what made you guys want to work on Splits as a part of this hackathon?
Yeah, do you know the game Settlers of Catan? It's like a board game, kind of has like a cult following. Anyways, a mutual friend of Will and mine, this guy Tommy, had recently moved to San Francisco, so had Will, and Tommy set up a game night. And both Will and I were there. And I remember after the fact, I texted Tommy being like, hey, Will seems awesome. You know, I didn't get his information. Like, do you mind sharing his phone number with me? And Tommy goes on to explain that he pretty much set up that game night so that he could set me and Will up together because he thought that we would get along and work together. So it was pretty funny. But yeah, so actually, I guess before ETH Global, it goes back to Tommy. Shout out to Tommy Gibbons if he ever listens to this. But so Tommy introduced us. Will was working on his own startup. I was still at SV Angel at the time. We kind of just stayed in touch, became friends socially. And then in 2019, I had left SV Angel. Will was working on his own startup and kind of figuring out what the next steps of that were going to be. I was doing some like part-time consulting contract work for this family office in San Francisco, and we had a beautiful office in the Presidio. And I was like, Will, why don't you come in, work from this office? We have plenty of space. And, if it doesn't work out with the business you're working on, like, I'm sure there's extra work at the family office. I knew that they were hiring, smart people to build a bunch of the software. And so that ended up happening. And so Will joined the family office alongside me. Again, we're kind of this like 2-person team. I come out from like the front end product design. Will comes out from like the back end architecture. So like between the two of us, we were kind of this like, I don't know, like MVP team that would go and like build out this like proof of concept. If like we saw traction and people were using it, then like we hand it off to like the actual engineering department, and they would go and like productize it and like make sure it was like bug free and scalable and all that stuff. And so Will and I really liked that that position of just like being able to like try a bunch of these new products or build these out and see what sticks. That was like late 2019, and then obviously the pandemic comes in early 2020. Both Will and I were like, we weren't thrilled at the situation we were in, pandemic aside. Just like working for the family office like wasn't a very like gratifying place to be. There was no future for us, and we both very much value working hard and having a lot of work. I don't think we're ones that really like to be bored, I guess. And so with the pandemic going on, we were kind of just like, all right, let's pause. Like, we don't really know what's going to happen in the next few months. And so we ended up staying at that family office doing part-time work for about a year, I would say, a year and a half, pretty much all of 2020. And then towards the end of 2020, we were kind of like, all right, we have our feet under us. There's no future here. We both were like spending all of our free time like reading about what was going on with like NFTs, and you had like bonding curves coming out back then, and you had like Euler and like all these like very interesting, I think like Catalog had just like announced, and like there were a bunch of like very interesting projects. And I actually remember very, very vividly, I between SV Angel and starting Splits, I also like bought this like old Sprinter van and like converted it into like a tiny home, which is a whole different conversation. But I was in the van and I was with my now wife, and we were driving to the East Coast to visit family for a little while. And I was on my phone, and I remember I had like Rainbow installed, I believe, and I used Uniswap on my phone, and being able to just like connect your wallet on the mobile device, like that was a better experience. That was I would say like a non-arguable better experience than like signing with Google, signing with Facebook. And at that point I was like, oh crap, like maybe the like tech is here. Like think like the dev tooling, the infrastructure is good enough to like really be able to build like a pretty solid consumer experience. And so that really piqued my interest, because again, I'm more on like the product design front end, making things functional versus like the back end, the systems architecture. And so that really got me very interested in building something more like consumer facing in the crypto space. Will and I had kind of like brainstormed and again built out some of these like MVPs for like much larger projects than Splits has now become. And it became clear to us that like if we wanted to ship something, it had to be small. That was something that we both felt strongly about, was just you learn by experimenting, you learn by doing, not at least for me and for Will, right? Learning by actually like trying something is so much more valuable than learning by like reading what someone else has done. And so we got to the point where we were like, all right, we need to ship something. And we had talked to like Kartik and a few others in our network, just to get their feedback on like, hey, like, here's some ideas that we're kicking around. And of course, like everybody was like, oh, don't do this like decentralized legal system, because like there are too many stakeholders and like arbitration, whatever, like that's a hassle. And I had read this post that Dennis and the Mirror team had written about their implementation of Splits, and I was like, that is really interesting, coming at it from the like SV Angel, like the venture capital world. I was like, equity is at the core of like anything that gets created, right? And having assurances about a future state is really, really important. And that is like why you would set up like some sort of like legal entity, be like an LLC or a C Corp or something. Or if you don't choose to do that, you should have like a very high degree of like social trust, knowing that the other person isn't going to like, screw you over. And I thought that the way that the Mirror team had kind of outlined the simplicity of this idea of a split was really interesting. And also like at SV, I feel like time and again, you'd see the biggest companies, the biggest products start out looking like something very small and very like obvious in hindsight, right? And so I actually felt like, at first I kind of pitched this to Will, and I was like, hey, how about we build like a really good version of a split contract? And he's like, that's like too simple. There's nothing there. And I was like, actually, I think that's like a really good thing, because we started looking at Mirror and Open Zeppelin had their like payment splitter implementation. I think Foundation had like maybe soon after Mirror had like gotten in the mix, and it kind of became clear to me that like, okay, a lot of people will need this, and yet like why aren't people using these contracts? Because they really weren't being used that much. You can see all this, right? This information on chain. And so we started talking to some folks, and so we kind of focused the protocol around a few key areas around composability, everything existing on chain, and being like maximally gas efficient on mainnet, and other networks too. But I think the gas efficiency on mainnet was a real differentiator for us at first. And so anyway, so we knew we had to ship something. We knew that there was an ETH Global Hackathon coming up that was 3 weeks long. And we're like, great, 3 weeks, it's not nothing. You can ship something of substance. You're not going to be able to like boil the ocean, like ship something enormous, but like 3 weeks is like enough to like ship something meaningful. So then we identified splits as being like, okay, here are 3 areas that we would make considerable improvements to around on-chain efficiency, composability. And then at that point, it was kind of just like off to the races, like, all right, what's the stack that we're going to use? And we like played around with like Scaffold ETH and a handful of others, and ended up just kind of like building our own. It's just like a Vercel, Next.js, React, TypeScript, Tailwind app, so it's pretty straightforward. But yeah, over the course of 3 weeks, we got more or less the MVP built out. Again, the back end and front end weren't like totally talking to each other that well. A little duct tape went a long way for that presentation. But 2 things happened that I think really like clicked for us. Number one was that a lot of the judges were like, why doesn't this exist? This is so obvious. I would use this in like 5 different ways tomorrow. Someone was even like, like flash loans were kind of like a big thing back in like, 2021. And someone was even like, most flash loans, or a lot of flash loans, like aren't completely created and captured by one person. So like this could be the payout address of a flash loan, and you can make these flash loans get bigger and bigger the more complex they are, with like more people contributing and working on it. I was like, oh, that's like interesting. So I'm like Googling what is the flash loan, all that stuff, right? We're still like fairly new to the space at the time. But the other one that I thought was maybe more telling was we were selected as like one of the finalists for ETH Global. And so for that hackathon, they also had, I think it was like 1,000 or I don't know, a few hundred US or DAI that they were giving out as a prize to the finalists. And there were 2 people that worked on this, me and Will, and ETH Global reaches out and they're like, hey, can you send us one of your wallet addresses so that we can send the earnings and you can split it amongst yourselves? And, Will and I have a deep relationship. That's fine. Right. But like, what if you just met someone at this hackathon, and what if that hackathon were like a much bigger project, right? Like having actually some structure in place that isn't a DAO, that isn't this like big, heavy thing. It just kind of like clicked for me. I was like, oh crap, like a hackathon project, like they don't start as companies, but like, hey, why not just like have something set up ahead of time? Because it costs like 50 cents, if that, to create one of these things. So yeah, honestly, just like since then, we can talk about it, but like it's really kind of taken on a life of its own. Just the people that have reached out, and we're not at this point. It feels really cool because like we're not the ones like, oh, like these are all the things that we think we need to build. It's more like, hey, we're just trying to play catch up to like the requests that are coming in from people actually using it. Right. And I just feel very grateful to be in that position. So. Yeah,
it's a good segment into when splits first came up on my radar, because you mentioned at the time Mirror had a splits implementation, Foundation had a splits implementation, but I think one of the challenges is that they were very platform dependent. Like Mirror had their own way that they were doing splits, Foundation had their own way that they were doing splits, and I think when you and I first connected, the idea of like a generalized splits protocol for the entire ecosystem that wasn't built for like one specific platform just really resonated with me. And I know that there was a lot of conversation, you mentioned gas optimizations, and at that point in time, we were talking like hundreds of dollars in gas to make a transaction. Like if you did make a transaction, it had to be very intentional. If you wanted to send ETH to 10 addresses, you were paying like $50, $100 just to send ETH around, like irregardless of the amount. Right. And so being able to have just an address that you could just do a one-time deposit and know that everyone was going to receive their money in the absence of you having to push 10 different ETH transactions to 10 different addresses, it was just very obvious to me that it was necessary at the time. And I feel like it was a really good timing event too, because this is right when platforms like Sound XYZ started to come online. I know you guys are really involved with the Chaos project. And I think a healthy transition from here would be help our listeners better understand how Splits fits into the music side of things. So for example, the relationship you guys have with Chaos, let's kind of start there, and then we can maybe move into, sound and kind of what happens on the back end there and how Splits kind of plays into it all.
Yeah, for sure. So Chaos, that came about. Matthew Chame, who helped kind of like bring Songcamp to life, he, I think, signed up for our like newsletter at one point, or our, we had like an email collection for him, and I saw he signed up, and so I like Googled him and found him on Twitter and sent him an email just being like, hey, Songcamp looks really interesting. Would love to chat more about how you're thinking of using Splits, right? Because he just showed interest in it, and he reached out, so I followed up. And that first conversation, I think it was either that first conversation, the next like two, led to some very, very interesting things. So Matthew and the Songcamp team had used Mirror Splits for, I think, their second camp, which was Electra, if I remember correctly. And though it worked, there are some limitations, and namely like just the amount of funds that need to flow through one of those splits. They're really, really well designed for a very large number of people, but catering to that small group of people was maybe not the like biggest consideration for that implementation. And so Matthew was like very, very acutely, he was very familiar with the problem that needed to be solved, and he had tried to solve it using something else. And so when we were talking about the solution that we were bringing to the table, his eyes just lit up and he was very excited. And so really ever since then, it's been an awesome relationship with Songcamp. We actually, Will and I both participated as members of the third camp of Chaos. And so Chaos was 77 people. The vast majority are musicians. There are a handful of people on the kind of podcast, the marketing, the operation side. Then there are also a handful of people on the technical side, because we built out a whole website, we built out contracts, we built out a minting experience, and we also built out what has now become Liquid Splits. And so before Songcamp Season 3, Chaos emerged, we're chatting with Matthew, and each split, splits can be optionally made mutable, meaning a given address has the ability to control or modify that split in the future. So the most, kind of like least social trust, lowest level of social trust would be an immutable split that can never be changed. But there are many reasons why you might want to update the split in the future. And so you can add a controller if you'd like. And many people are choosing to add Gnosis safes as the controller, which makes sense, right? We need, 5 of 9 people to sign off on this, or even just, 2 of 3, if you want to make changes to the split. And Matthew came to us and he said, well, if you can make the Gnosis safe the controller of a split, and the Gnosis safe is just a smart contract, couldn't you just make any other smart contract the controller of a split? And it kind of occurred to me, I was like, yeah, okay, like, yeah, that makes sense. That contract just needs to have like some custom logic, some custom code built into it to be able to modify the split. And he's like, okay, that means that we could create an NFT contract that is the controller of the split. And that way, whenever NFTs change hands, the split gets updated. And we hadn't thought about that before, right? We had thought about like, hey, someone wants to be able to modify the split. Maybe that can be a person, or that could be a group of people like a Gnosis safe. But could you actually make the modification of the split programmatic based on other on-chain state? It was not something that we had thought about. And Matthew really brought this to our attention. And so he was like, hey, I have an idea. Like, we're still figuring out the economics and how value will flow within Songcamp Season 3 or Chaos. Because we were both Will and I were pretty excited about this potential for what has become Liquid Splits now. And he's like, you guys are going to productize this. Like, why don't you just come be a participant in Songcamp in Chaos and build out the Liquid Splits technology of it, and you can actually like see what it's like firsthand to be like creating all these like NFT contracts and having this big drop. And so our relationship with that's how our relationship with Songcamp started. We've now productized Liquid Splits into our app, and you can create Liquid Splits through our app, all of that stuff. We actually modified our implementation slightly, so now we use 1155s instead of 721s, but you can modify it however you want. And even Patrick Sweetman has built a really great library as well to help people use 721s instead of 1155s as well, to create custom artwork and metadata for the split. So yeah, SongCamp, and it's awesome because SongCamp continues to do new camps like every year, every so often, and then they're also doing a lot of these mini camps and these mini releases. And a lot of other musicians or musicians who have participated in SongCamp go on to have their own artists, their own projects, and their own bands kind of form. And so that's been a really great source of user feedback for us, just because I find people in SongCamp are continuously pushing the edge, and that is where I think splits excel, is at the edge, at this edge of experimentation. That's typically where like most progress is made. And so the SongCamp relationship has been great, and we're just very lucky to have folks like Matthew and Russ and Mark and that whole team in our corner and really pushing us on how we can improve the product. So they kind of use it more on the I would say more on like as a user of the front end, if that makes sense, right? So they're going into app.splits.org and they're creating splits and they're distributing and they're withdrawing and they're doing all that stuff. The sound integration is much different. In fact, a lot of artists and folks on sound don't even know that they're using splits behind the scene. But when we were right after the ETH Global Hackathon, and before we launched publicly, we participated in this group called Zeitgeist. Sina Habibian is incredible. He's been a close friend of ours for a while. I see you're nodding, like you get that too. Like he's such a voice of reason and just like a very a person I look up to. And so he was at the Ethereum Foundation for many years. Before that, started TrueBit, a kind of an early layer 2, if you will, scaling solution. And so he was running this experiment called Zeitgeist, which was a group, a period of 3 months. Groups of builders would come in and just kind of work together. So it was remote, but we got together in person as well. And Sound was also going through that same program. I don't know exactly how David and Vignesh and Matt had met Sina, but the three of them were in the program. Will and myself, we were in the program. And it was just one of those things where they were gearing up to launch Sound publicly and they were heads down focused on that. They knew that right after launch, though, they would need to introduce splits because they were already getting feedback from like beta users like, hey, I have a vocalist or I have a producer, I have this other person that like needs to be receiving part of this income. That's the agreement that we had. And so, I mean, they kind of surveyed the scene and looked at a bunch of different options. And, you know, it was one of those things where they kind of they compared us to what their other options were, and you know, within a few days had us like fully integrated. We have like an open source SDK that they use, and so actually, yeah, if you're a creator, musician on Sound, when you go in and you create the different percentages, that's actually spitting up a split on the back end that then gets set as the payout recipient for that song. And so, and you know, Sound has integrated the contract functions from splits into their front end, and so you don't actually even need to use the splits UI through Sound. You can do all of that through their own dashboard. So yeah, both SongCamp and Sound, very different ways in which splits supports those communities, but kind of similar end result, which is allowing people to experiment and to work together.
Totally. And I wanted to bring this up because I feel like it really highlights how integral Splits is to the on-chain music ecosystem, in the sense that anytime that there's more than one person getting paid out on a song, chances are that Splits is probably the thing under the hood that's making it happen. And I find it really interesting to highlight the difference between SongCamp, which is like 77-person massive project in the form of chaos here, Liquid Splits, like very on the fringe implementation that's very satisfying to people who are like deeply crypto native, versus Sound, which is like, I have a collaborator on a song, we need to split this 50-50. How do we do that? You know, and I think that a technology that's able to serve both of those audiences is very compelling to me, because it allows us to create, you know, this on-chain earnings rail that I think is very fundamental to music as a whole. You know, and if you look at the way that music industry payouts happen today, you're typically going through either a PRO or a distributor or just like a million different sites. And I just really love that Splits has kind of become this core piece of infrastructure that anytime there's a song on Sound, you don't need to worry about if this artist is using this distributor, if this artist is using this distributor. There's no like artist gets paid and then collaborator gets paid after the fact. It's very much there in real time. It's like generate an address, put this on the split, and every time that song makes money, you know for a fact you're going to get paid out because that split exists, and it kind of removes the trust from that primary artist to have to take the money and pay you out, which is very synonymous with your early example of your hackathon, where it's like, even though you and Will had a great relationship as co-founders, being able to provide a splits address that says, hey, we're going to split this 50-50, I think it just gives a lot more confidence in collaboration.
Yeah, it gives confidence in collaboration. It happens like more or less in real time. There's a cool anecdote that I have on that, but also like it provides transparency for the community at large, right? Like there's way more clarity, which, and we can get into that in a second about like what the tools are that we're building right now around like clarity and legibility and all that stuff. But I think that's actually a big piece of it. It's not just for the people who are participating, but it's for understanding how the value flows and where that exists, where those different like nodes exist and how they're related. And it's really valuable to be able to see that at a higher level, not just about myself, but about like the community at large. If I'm collaborating with you and I see that you're collaborating with like Rio and Daniel and stuff, like that actually allows me presumably to like have a lot more trust in you as like, a manager and someone to support me. But on the real time piece, it was pretty cool when Sound had first integrated splits. I believe the very first drop was the selection drop they did in like early 2022. And this was a big milestone for us because this was the first time splits was being used in production in Sound. And so we were monitoring it very closely. And it was pretty wild to see the drop go live, and then like within hours, the funds like ended up in everybody, like all the recipients' wallets, right? And I think it cost, I remember I sent a note to like our investors at that point, and I think it was like $40 to distribute like hundreds of thousands, right? Like in real time, they get paid that same day, and it costs like a tiny percent, like basis points to even get that done. Like it was one of those things where it's like, crypto rails are superior for some things, right? I'm not saying it's like this panacea and like better for everything, right? But there are certain things that it is undoubtedly much, much better for. And I think experimentation and like people coming together to create something is one of those situations where it is a 10x, 100x better experience than what exists today. So that might be a hill that I die on, but we'll get that's bigger picture stuff. But I think going back to just like the ability to see who else is on the split is valuable, but also being able to understand what that split represents, right? Because typically what we see is that a split is downstream of some economic value creation event, right? So that could be an NFT project, it could be a DAO like AirSwap having like protocol fees baked in. It could be a group like Nouns has adopted splits for a bunch of their different drops that they're doing, and so there's some economic value generating event that then funds come down into the split and then get paid out, routed to the right individuals. And up until very recently, all those addresses have been 0x, they've been hexadecimal addresses, right? So you, as Cooper, if you're part of like 20 or 30 different splits, when you open up your dashboard and you receive your email statements, you're saying you received, $5 from 0x1234, which is not that valuable, right? And so because we've seen how widely the Web3 music industry has adopted splits and how social splits inherently are, what we've realized actually our application is this really interesting kind of neutral Switzerland type of layer where you have Sound and you have Catalog and you have Songcamp and you have a lot of these like music platforms that are integrating splits in one way or another, and all of the artists and the creators who are on those platforms are getting paid through splits. And so now the splits dashboard is a way for them to actually be able to really clearly see where those earnings are coming from. And so just recently we launched the ability to be able to add names to splits. So you can add a private name, which means only you can see it, but you can also choose to make that name public, right? So for any NFT project that is public, and there are 10 different people on that split, someone going in and being able to add a name to that split is a net positive for everybody else on the split, right? Because now in their earnings summary and their statements, they see the actual song that means something to them, that carries meaning, not the 0x1234 address, which carries meaning to computer, right? It creates a lot more human readability and legibility of the ecosystem. And so what we've discovered is that by seeing a lot of adoption in the music space, it creates the ability for the Splits app to actually be able to again be that third party, be that way by which musicians are able to, and creators at large are able to understand where their funds are coming from. And so right now it's fairly single player, but over the next few months, expect that to become much more multiplayer. You can have multiple people part of the same organization. The way in which you organize and report on where those earnings are coming from will get much better. So think, things like tags, folder systems, things of that sort. We also recently announced like email notification. So very simple, but just say, hey, Coop, you got paid today, right? Or hey, Coop, you have $100 waiting to be withdrawn. Things like that, that again, just like increase the transparency and legibility of the ecosystem at large.
Totally. And I think in a lot of ways, it's the Trojan horse of what makes putting music on chain compelling, in the sense that you can get paid in real time and understand where that money is coming from. And I think for someone like myself that's working with many different artists, many songs, we're in the very early stages of like the on-chain music economy. Say in total, there's maybe 10,000 songs in total that exist across like the whole ecosystem. There are like hundreds of thousands of songs that get uploaded to Spotify every single week. And if you think about like an organization that has real-time payments with real-time attribution, it gets really exciting to think about like categorizing that and being able to say, if I'm a label and I want to put my entire catalog on chain, me being able to dissect 100 different 0x1234 addresses is going to be a total nightmare. But if you can create a system where it says, this is song 1, this is song 2, on song 1 the splits are 50-50, on song 2 the splits are 25-25-25, it makes it a lot easier for artists to understand. And I think the next step of this whole process is understanding that getting paid on chain is much more efficient and much more straightforward than what exists today. But to your point about making that legible, most artists don't even know how to make a MetaMask wallet, let alone how to log into Splits, let alone how to, withdraw their ETH and understand what the value of that is. So I think that the opportunity here for curators and labels and kind of this whole, distribution layer of on-chain music is to be able to better understand what's going on chain. Like being able to provide an artist with a statement that says, you made $200 from this song. It was distributed to your wallet on this day. This amount went to your manager's address. This amount went to your address. Here's where you can find it. Here's where you can track it. Here's the price of ETH at the time that you got paid out. There's just so much rich data opportunities that are available right there. And I think it's really important to highlight that Splits sitting as this kind of neutral Switzerland layer that you described earlier, and allowing people to enrich that data, contextualize it in the way that they see fit, and deliver that to artists. I think that that's the design space that I'm uniquely very excited about, with how Splits is going to continue to play a very, very integral role in this whole kind of ecosystem at large.
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. I'm very excited about it because there's obviously like the protocol, the technology, the contract layer, which is really important to make this all work, right? If the Splits contracts weren't working, none of this other platform would be possible. And yet, and contracts are really hard to iterate on, right? Because you deploy them, they're immutable. At least many of them are, especially when it comes to payment, right? And so it's the time elapsed, or the time required to create these things is immense, right? Like my guess is that most companies at scale will move to a hardware style release cycle for contracts, right? It'll happen like maybe twice a year, maybe once a year, right? And it'll be this big thing because they need to do audit. They need to get audited. Like a lot goes into deploying on-chain contracts. So you can't really iterate on those very quickly. What you can iterate on though is a traditional like software. It's traditional like web software, right? And so when we deploy some of these new kind of like team organization products like that, those don't have to be bug free. And in fact, they probably won't be bug free, because if they were, then we wouldn't be shipping fast enough, right? And so there's certain things that we can like really iterate on and like improve the product and get that flywheel going. And there are other things that are a little bit slower. And I think when you combine these two, it creates some really interesting, though challenging, kind of like design mechanisms that are required for building a team that can ship both. So I'm very excited about the team that we're building, and just about the space and the product and everything.
In a weird way, I kind of like that this experimentation is happening with the market where it is today, because I can only imagine how chaotic this would be if artists were making the amount of money they were making during the last bull market right now and trying to navigate all the splits that come with it. I think the biggest criticism of on-chain music has been the opportunity and the ability to pay rights holders accordingly to what they've earned. And I think that music as a industry is notoriously difficult because there are so many different stakeholders. You have the primary artist, you have songwriters, you have producers, you have managers, you have mix and master engineers. There's a whole variety of people that can come into the picture. You have a label, a distributor, a curator. I could go on and on, but basically there's so many different parties that being able to better understand like what the new default is for getting paid on chain is very exciting to me. And it's very gratifying that we can do these experiments with 0.1 ETH, a couple $100. It's on a layer 2, so it doesn't cost a lot of money, because it gives us this opportunity to really unpack what it means to get people paid on chain and allow them to actually understand what they got paid on chain, prior to us getting to this place where there is so much money flowing around that it just gets lost in the sauce forever. And I think in a lot of ways, the success of on-chain music as a whole is going to be very much aligned with our confidence in being able to report and sort of give artists understanding of what's happening when they're getting paid out. Because if we can show them that earning money on chain is simpler and more efficient and more transparent than what exists today, I think that's a big reason why artists would choose to come on chain, is because they know if I put a song on Sound and someone buys that today, I'm able to see exactly how much I made from that in real time, versus something like Spotify where there's a 3 to 4 month back-end accounting process that happens where you don't know how much you're getting paid. And when you do get paid, you just say, thank you that I got paid at all, but you have no conception of where that money's actually coming from.
Right. And I think that, to your point, trying to like quote test and prod or like experiment when like there's meaningful, like really large amounts like flowing through it is just harder, right? Because the stakes are much higher. The opportunity cost is larger. Whereas right now, the fact that things are a little slower, I think is actually a really great time to like get the product dialed in and get this experience dialed in. And your point that being able to report on what's happening is as big of a project and as important as actually like making sure it does happen, right? Because if you can say, hey, like this happened, just take my word for it, right? That kind of like is the whole premise of a lot of like what's happening in crypto. Whereas if you can actually say, hey, you don't have to take my word for it, here's how you can understand exactly what's going on. I'll make that report very, very easy for you to digest. I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle that so far is, not anyone's fault, but I think so far it's kind of gone overlooked. Right. And so now we're just playing a little bit of catch up.
Yeah, and let's unpack that a little bit more, because I want to get more into like the exploratory, where does this go, kind of on like the tail end of this episode. And I think for me, looking at the way that Splits was used in something like Chaos, right, you had 77 people involved, and being able to manage one giant Splits contract that coordinated splits across so many individuals is a Herculean task, right? You have a million different contributors. How do you figure out who gets what percentage? Do you start using things like Coordinape, etc.? That's a whole beast in and of itself. Then you go over to like EPs and albums. So let's think about Splits in the context of Criteria, Daniel, and Rio, right? Not as many collaborators, but still like a good amount of collaborators to have to think about. And that's across multiple songs. And so in the case of Criteria, this was at a time and place where it was minted under one contract. Everyone kind of shared a split under the same collection. But now we're into this world where every split is happening on a song level. And so when it comes down to like an album, you're going to have unique splits for 12 different songs that's going to round up into an album. And it almost feels like we're getting more and more granular with each individual component of where this goes, up into a world where I'm optimistic that when we start to introduce things like AI, right, and we start to introduce like what happens if you use a Kanye vocal, how does Kanye actually get his royalties on this? I think that this is kind of the North Star where I get excited about what splits can become, because we can now start to earmark percentage of earnings for addresses that you've never talked to before, where you can say, hey, if I make a song and I feature a collaborator on it and I remix it and I've never talked to them, I've never been able to get in contact, you can pay them without needing to contact them. And I think that kind of like honeypot mentality of like, hey, there are funds for you here on the table that's yours to come and claim if you so choose to do so. I think that it's a really compelling mechanism for bringing more people on chain, and one that I'm excited to see unfold more over the coming years here. Yeah,
ditto. I think that we're already starting to see glimpses of that, right? Actually, just today, before this call, I saw Gigamesh released a new song with Grimes, right? And Grimes, I thought was super cool. She went out and said publicly on Twitter, you can use my vocal, you can use all this technology as long as I get 50% of the proceeds, right? And so that was a way to like publicly attest, hey, you have my stamp of approval so long as you follow the rules that I'm kind of portraying here, which is 50%. And so people are doing it that way. I think there's also a world in which there's some like product, there's some like technology that gets built that actually allows a lot of these like agreements to be a little bit less soft and a little bit more firm. And so those could be on-chain messages, or, we can kind of like pontificate on what that might look like. But I think that this design space is really, really interesting, especially as you get more people creating with these AI models. And like some of those AI models might actually have their own like split distributions like baked into them, right? I could see a world where that happens as well.
Yeah, and we've talked about term sheets, right? Even the simple decision of like, me and you made a song. What are the splits on this term sheet? Is it 50-50? Is it something different? Being able to have on-chain proof that you signed that this is 50%, I signed that this is 50%. We have like written attestation that these are the splits associated with it. I find that very compelling. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot more broadly, where there's a big challenge right now around putting music on chain. There's not a very compelling reason to do it from like a cultural standpoint. And I think a lot of the people that are putting their music on chain have trust that this will become something in the future, but it's not like it's making substantial enough revenue where it's like, I need to put every song on here because I'm making thousands of dollars like you might have like a year or two ago. And I think something that I've been excited to think about is, how do you create earnings for people who are not crypto native to get them to want to explore more with the technology without requiring them to go through all of the traditional hurdles that exist today? And so to break that down, it's like, I'm an artist who's never downloaded SoundCloud, who's never bought ETH before. I shouldn't need to download MetaMask and learn what Ethereum is to be able to earn $100 off of a song that I made with my friend. So I think the design space there is like, how do you start to allow people to connect with social logins, where maybe instead of me having to set up a MetaMask, I'm just signing in with a Twitter wallet? Or like you said earlier, if I'm an artist that is working with the label, instead of me having to set up my own MetaMask, how can the label start to send statements to the artist where alongside Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, you now have a line item for sound. And in that, you are able to give them $100 to their bank account. But as the label, you're kind of taking care of that all yourself on the back end. I think that level of abstraction from artist gets paid ETH for someone collecting a song to artists being able to receive dollars in their bank account, that feels like it's kind of like the spectrum that we need to be able to cross as an industry for this to actually start to see real significant adoption in a way that feels meaningful for the music industry as a whole.
Yeah. There's no shortage of infrastructure to be built to make that system, that process a lot easier. And I think that, maybe there's a world, maybe there's a future in which Splits plays a role in that. We announced Swapper recently, which allows you to get paid in whatever currency you want, regardless of what you're sent. So I know there are many folks who actually prefer not to hold ETH and wrapped ETH because of the volatility. They would much rather just hold USDC or DAI. And so, by using a swapper kind of above your primary wallet, you can say the only currencies that are coming in are going to be these pegged currencies, USDC, DAI, et cetera. Now, if you were to take that kind of like to the logical next step, like, could you actually just convert that into USD and send it to their, Bank of America or whatever account they have directly? Now that gets into a much harder problem to solve and requires a lot of legal hoops to jump through. So by no means something that we're eager to solve today, but I think that just being able to build systems that enable more experimentation is really, really important. And, experimentation is how progress gets made. And when the cost of experimentation is really high, progress isn't going to get made as quickly, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you've seen that with like just the way in which new construction gets handled in like major cities. Like there's more and more red tape, which means less things get done, and the cost of doing them is way higher, right? And I think that's a large reason why you see more experimentation happening on Zora and Base and these other L2s, right? The cost to do it is just much, much lower. And so that'll be a big focus of ours for the next few months, is just, Splits and its ecosystem is like very well covered on mainnet and Optimism and Arbitrum and Polygon. But a lot of the newer chains, Zora, Base, et cetera, we've got to make a few updates to like Swapper, for instance, to get the Oracle deployed on those new addresses. So it'll get done. And we just need to make sure that we're always at the edge of where people are experimenting. I think that's where we learn the most, both individually and as a society.
Totally. And I think one of the most challenging things with crypto today is recognizing how hard it is to do the simplest tasks. Like an artist gets paid out on sound, they make 0.1 ETH and they want to withdraw to their bank account to go and buy a burrito. And it's like the amount of overhead that comes in for me being able to help an artist understand that they received 50% of that 0.1 ETH, that they need to now withdraw that ETH from a splits contract. They need to bridge that ETH from Optimism back to mainnet. They need to convert that ETH to USDC. withdraw that USDC to Coinbase, and then off ramp
Right.
that USDC to USD and withdraw. It's like, it's crazy. You know what I mean? It's like,
Right.
that's actually the process that exists today. And it blows my mind that that's like where we are. But I think that in saying that, that whole process I just described is like the design space that I encourage anyone listening to this to really zoom in on, which is to say, if you are someone that's looking to help artists be active in this ecosystem, make it easier for them to get paid and to use that money to buy a burrito. Because if you can do that, I feel like that's going to unlock so much potential. And I also just want to give a quick shout out to like this 0xSplits backend that's going live, like as we were talking about in real time, this team's infrastructure. This is like the, you know, the golden era in California, you know, hundreds of years ago for like on-chain earnings. Like I get in there and I see these splits contracts that are just 0x, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. The fact that they're unnamed and you kind of have the ability to go in and contextualize all these contracts for the 50, 100,000 years to come, it's such an exciting opportunity. And I'm just very thankful to be involved in such an early stage on like really creating the enrichment of this data that allows it to become sort of the cementing building block for the music industry as a whole.
Yeah, it's a net positive, right? It's all the people, all the creatives, the artists that you work with are better off when you go through and add that context for them, right? And so, yeah, we're very excited about this. I think that to your point, the process of actually, you know, earning something on chain to being able to go buy a burrito off chain, there's a lot of work to be done there. And I think that's just an indication of how much opportunity there is, right? Like the fact that that is hard to do to me isn't like, oh, crypto, whatever is broken. It's like, oh yeah, we just have a lot of things to catch up on. There's just a lot of things that need to get built. And so, you know, what's the Mark Andreessen, it's time to build? Like, you know, I think that shows it. It's not saying, oh, this system is wrong or this system doesn't work, right? We've just been using the one system for hundreds and hundreds of years, and now there's a new system that's coming up, and yes, of course it will be challenging to make it work perfectly. It'll take time.
Right. And we didn't even really dabble on all of the implications around like what this means as a collector, as an owner of music. You know, you talked earlier about like equity being the core building block of these different companies, and something we've been experimenting a lot is like, if you collect a song, what does it look like for you to be able to share in those on-chain earnings because you're on the split itself? You know, you see projects like Royal, Another Block, et cetera, all these royalty-bearing platforms that are trying to port off-chain earnings on-chain. But the biggest thing that I'm excited about is like what happens when the payments are fundamentally on-chain at the beginning, and how do you start to share those earnings with your biggest supporters? I mean, that's an entirely another rabbit hole that I have to save for a future conversation, but it just goes to say that there are really cool ways to use splits. Like we've put collectors from one song onto a split where there's 100 addresses that are earning 20% of a future song, and there's so many fun experiments to play around with that I just can't speak highly enough of splits and what you guys have built. I also just want to give a quick shout out to the fact that you were hyping up the fact that you guys have a team of 6 now, and that's like a huge deal for you, and how much you've been able to build as a team of 3 before that. So I guess to turn that into a question, are there any sort of closing thoughts or sentiments that you want to share about splits as a whole before we wrap this episode?
I mean, we've seen incredible adoption within the music space. We're starting to see adoption outside of the music space. And, you know, whether it's the new contracts that we launched, like Waterfall, which is a debt-like structure, or Swapper, which we talked about, right? Those ideas aren't coming from us. Those ideas are coming from people reaching out saying, hey, it'd be cool if I could do this, or hey, I can do this, but is it possible to do that, right? And I think just the more feedback, the more questions we get, the better the product becomes. And so we're focused on this, you know, intently, full time. We're a team of 6 now, and there's a lot more that we want to build, and we know we need to. And so the more feedback that we can receive, the better. So that'd be my one ask, is just support at splits.org, Abram D on Telegram, like just share what you're getting stuck with, share what's working, what's not, and we'll continue to make it better.
And if you're an artist that's listening to this, I encourage you to go into the Splits dashboard, app.splits.org, and just contextualize your songs. Like, give a name to it. You know, go ahead and start tagging some things, add some bookmarks, etc. You know, as we alluded to earlier, there is so much opportunity to enrich this data that's out there. And I think that as an artist, being able to go in and really start to make sense of where you've made the most money on chain, it's a very gratifying process. So, Abram, I just want to say thank you so much for being on here, man. You're a source of light in this bear market for me, and something that I'm very excited to help champion to others. But I really appreciate you making time to come on and talk today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. These conversations, they're fun and they're energizing for me. So I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back next week, and I will see you guys again soon. So everyone have a good week, and we'll chat on the next episode. Peace.